Hey class, in this video we are going to do a Photoshop intro. I'm going to go over a lot of basics in terms of setting up your project and getting everything ready. So some of this stuff may seem a little too basic, but it kind of depends on your level of experience. If you're very familiar with Photoshop and with using a computer in general, then a lot of the stuff is going to be a bit of a review. So just stick with it. We will get to some interesting stuff towards the end, but just want to make sure I go through all of the sort of basics about getting set up so that we're all on the same page. So if anything seems like sort of ridiculously basic, that's okay. We'll get into some good Photoshop stuff throughout the video, but just bear with me. And if you have any questions about how I set anything up or anything like that, just send me an email. So we're going to start with Brightspace as usual. Just want to kind of get us situated. So we're going to go into our class in Brightspace, and we'll just jump straight over to the Open Lab. And on here, let me make myself a little smaller. Let's go to the image topic. And so here I'm gonna, I'll post the videos as I create them. Right now there's not a whole lot here, but this first link is the first place you're gonna wanna get started. So this link will take you to some instructions for how to register for the Adobe Creative Cloud. This is what you need to do to be able to use Photoshop for free. If you go to register for Photoshop and it asks you for any credit card info or anything like that, you do not need to pay for Photoshop for this class. So if you have any issues with that, let me know and we can go over it together. But you should be using Photoshop for free. So when you click on this link, it's going to take you over to this article on the BMCC website. And this gives you some instructions about how to sign up for Adobe Photoshop. I'm not really going to be able to recreate this process just because I already have an account. But the process is pretty easy. You just go to this creativecloud.adobe.com link, and then you're going to use your CUNY first login to log in here. So this is the same login that you use to get into Brightspace. So if you log into Adobe using that login, it will set up your CUNY account, and then you can download the apps, or you can download Creative Cloud from there. You can see I'm logged in here under my BMCC account. So this should work for anybody who's registered for the class. If you have any issues with this, let me know and we'll go over it. Once you log in, you will be able to go here to where it says apps, and you'll be able to download Photoshop. If you see something like Photoshop, I forget what it's called, but there's sort of like a free version of Photoshop, then you're not in the right place. So if you have any issues with that, just let me know and we can figure it out. But there should be a download button here. You can download Photoshop and start using it. So again, let me know if you have any issues there, but it should work for everybody, and it should work whether you're on a Mac or PC. The Adobe website should be able to figure out where you are, and it'll download the right installer. But again, if you run into any of the issues with that, let me know right away, because we are going to be using Photoshop a lot in the first 3 weeks, and so we don't want to waste any time. If you have any issues with that, just let me know. If you don't have a computer that can run Photoshop, it is a pretty performance heavy application. We do have computers on campus where you can do that. So again, if you have any tech issues, just let me know as soon as you can so we can get those resolved early on. Anyway, that's how you're going to get set up. I'm going to set up some folders on my computer to save my work before we actually start to create anything. So again, this may be a little bit of a review if you are very familiar with your computer, but I just want to go over some stuff just to make sure we're all on the same page. So before I really get started creating any media, the first thing I'm going to do is just make a folder and start to organize where I want to save my files. On Windows, I'm going to use the File Explorer. You can usually find this in your toolbar. If you don't see it there, just go to the search and type in File Explorer, and it should come up like that. And when you open this, you're just looking at the files on your computer. And so we just want to make sure we have our files set up correctly. This might look a little different than mine, if you're using the dark theme. This window might be have a black background and white text, but it should have the same basic thing. And I'll go over a couple things that may look different on your computer than mine. If you're on a Mac, your version of this is called the Finder. You're going to be able to find that in your dock. It's a little like smiley face guy. It looks pretty similar once you get it open, and it works exactly the same way. So if you have any issues with that on the Mac, let me know and we can go over it together. What I'm going to do first off for this very intro lesson is I'm going to go to my Documents folder, and you can see I have a bunch of different folders here. I have my class notes, I have my class recordings, I have some Zoom files, I have some Adobe files. I'm going to create a new folder here that is just for files that I'm creating for this course. So this is kind of like an umbrella folder for everything I'm going to make for the course. And I highly recommend you do the same thing so you don't lose your files or get lost with where you are. I'm going to go to New and make a new folder. And I'm going to call this MMP 100. You could just call it MMP 100. You could put Spring 2025, something like that. This is just the general folder we're going to use for everything that we create in the class. Once I've created that folder, I'm going to open it up and I'm going to create a new folder. And this is to organize my files even more. I'm going to call this Image. And this is where I'm going to put all the files that I'm going to create for my image project. So I'll go in here. And now you can see the path. If you look at this up here, we're in Documents, in this MMP 100 folder that I created, in this Image folder. Okay, so we're not actually going to put anything in here right now, but we just have it set up so that we can save our Photoshop file when we're ready. So our setup is all ready. We're ready to go ahead and open Photoshop. If you've run into any issues at this point, no worries. Just pause and let me know, and we can go over it together. So let's open Photoshop. If you've downloaded Photoshop and installed it, you should be able to just go into search and type in Photoshop, and it should show up like that. And if I hit enter, it'll open. And yours may look a little bit different than mine if it's the first time you've opened it. You may see some windows, suggesting that you do a tutorial or something like that. You can just, X out of those windows most of the time. Or if you want to go through the tutorials, you can do that as well. Eventually, you'll end up at a window that kind of looks like this. You will be at kind of the home screen for Photoshop. You can create a new file. You can open previous files, and you can see other files that you have open. You see my class slides from the previous video there. And so what we want to do is just create a new file, go over some of the basics of the interface, and then create our first image composition. So let's click on New File. This is going to give us a lot of different options for different presets. So for example, if you are working on a website design, it'll give you some presets based on typical website sizes. If you're working on something for mobile, you might see they have some different iPhone sizes in here. There's a lot of different presets. I'm just gonna use a basic preset that I use a lot. So this is in my recent preset. It's a custom setup. And what I'm gonna do is I'm just going to set the width and height that I wanna use in my image, and then set a couple settings. So if the width I'm going to use is 1024. That might seem like a kind of a random number, but if you remember from our previous image lecture when I was talking about how we save data on the computer, you probably remember that we save bytes, and bytes have bits of information that kind of go up representing numbers going 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256. These are called the powers of 2. And when we use powers of 2, the computer is just slightly faster. It's just a little bit better for performance. So I'm going to use powers of 2. And when we go from 128 to 256, then 512, then 1024. So if you see that 1024, you'll often see that number when you're working with digital images. That's why. One thing that you might have on is artboards. That doesn't really change much of what we're going to do in this lesson. I'm going to turn it off just because it takes up a little bit of space that we don't want to use. You'll see a couple other things. The resolution is 72 pixels per inch. That's fine. We don't really worry too much about that because we're sticking in the digital space. We're not going to be printing anything. You can also see the color mode is set to RGB. So remember we talked about RGB in our digital imaging lecture. And look, how it says 8 bits. Remember we talked about bits, and 8 bits makes a byte. And so we can see the concepts that we've covered, helping us understand what these menu items are for. So everything else we can leave the same. I'm just going to click create, and we're going to see our document. So this is going to look slightly different than what yours is probably going to look like. So what I'm going to do first is talk about the overall layout of the software. Photoshop is a big product. It has lots and lots of features. We're going to focus on a couple basic features in this lesson today, but it can be very overwhelming very quickly if you're not familiar with everything that's going on. So we're going to try to keep it simple. I'm going to hide myself for a moment while I set up my layout, but then I'll bring myself back once I've got it set up the way I want it. So I'm going to hide myself for just a moment. So if we look at the top menu here on Photoshop, all the way at the end, there's this menu item called Window. And if we look under here, there's a Workspace section. And if you just opened it for the first time, this is probably what your workspace looks like. You might also see the context window, where is that? I actually don't see that on here. Maybe it's farther down. Oh, here it is. So you might also see a little taskbar like this. This is going to kind of try to guess what you're wanting to do. Like you might want to import an image, you might want to generate an AI image, and if you hover over these, it'll kind of give you some tutorials about how to use them. I don't really use this. This is kind of a new feature. Nothing wrong with it, but I like to get this out of the way. So if you see that, you can just click hide bar. You can leave it there also if you want to. Okay, so this is the default layout. We see the main canvas here. You also probably will not see the ruler, so let me turn that off. So you're going to see the main canvas here. You're going to see your tools over here, and then there's some properties up here, and then some other windows over here. All of these things can be moved around and changed and edited, and so there's a couple changes that I like to make right away, just to focus on the main things that we want to focus on. So the main things we want to focus on today are layers. And if you're using a screen with a little bit of a higher resolution, you'll be able to see this better. I have a lower resolution screen just to make it easier to see everything in the videos that I'm recording. So my layers are stuck down here. So the first thing I usually do is I look for this layers tab and I pull it out. And you can pull it out and you can drag it around and put it wherever you want. But what I like to do is called docking it. So if you drag one of these windows close to another window, you'll see these blue lines come up, and this will kind of hint where it's going to go. And this is called docking your windows. So I want to dock my layers window right here, so it's really easily accessible. So I can make changes to the layers here. Everything else I'm going to leave the same. Sometimes I'll move. There's a history here which saves all the things that you do, and you can kind of go back and undo stuff. I don't use this very often, so sometimes I'll put this over here. So my color palette is a little bit closer and my properties window is a little bit closer. That's just kind of what I like to do. If I get a setting or a workspace that I really like, usually what I will do is I'll go to workspace and I'll save it. So I'll say new workspace, and I'll call this Owen's Cool Workspace, and I'll save that. And now if I go back to my workspaces, there's Owen's Cool Workspace. So I can always come back if I get a good setup that I like. All right, so I'll put myself back on the screen for now because I think there's room for me. Although I may have to move myself later. Anyway, let's talk about a few basic things. There's a lot going on here, so we're not going to go over everything, but I'm just going to get you started so you can start making an interesting image. And we're just going to use some basic shapes and talk about color and talk about layers, and we'll also talk a little bit about the grid and guides and things like that. So one thing I like to do before I really do anything else is I like to turn on, or at least set up, what's called the grid. So if you go into view and you go down here to show, you'll see there's an option to show the grid. And this grid I have set up, let me actually set this back to the defaults because it's not going to look like this for you. So let's go to edit. If we want to change the grid, we have to go to edit and go to preferences and then go to guides, grids, and rulers. And that should bring up a window. And here we see grid. And I'm going to set this back to what I think is the default, which is 1 inch. Okay, so yeah, that's the default grid. That's probably what you're looking at if you followed the steps so far. And that's fine, but you'll notice that it doesn't quite line up over here because it's based on inches. And we're not really worried about inches. We're just working in the digital space. So it doesn't line up exactly with the size of the image that I have. By the way, to zoom in, I am hitting the Alt key on my keyboard, and I'm using the scroll wheel on my mouse. So another thing that you can do is hit the Control key on your keyboard and hit 0, and that'll center your canvas. You can also hit Control+, and that'll zoom in, and Control- will zoom out. That's really useful for kind of moving the canvas around to focus on different details. Another thing I forgot to mention is that I am using a little mouse like this. This is called a 3-button mouse because it has 2 buttons and a scroll wheel. If you have one of these, I really highly recommend using it when you're working in Photoshop and other digital tools. If you don't have one, we have them at school. If you want to use them, send me an email and I'll let you know how to do that. I have kind of a fancy one, but you can get these for like $10, $20. So it's a good investment if you like this stuff. It's not necessary, but it can be really helpful for working on digital projects. Okay, so we've got our grid. We can turn this on and off. We can also hit Control and quotation mark to turn it on and off. You'll notice that a lot of things we can do in Photoshop involve keyboard commands. So I'll try to talk about what keyboard commands I'm using. These are just shortcuts on the keyboard so that you don't have to click on everything to do everything. But you can also click on stuff. So I can go to Show and I can turn grid on or off and do it again. So let's set up our grid. You don't have to use a grid, but I really like to use a grid. That's one of the advantages of working in a digital space is we can be very precise as opposed to in physical space. So let's go back to our preferences, go to grids, guide, and slices. I'm going to look at my grid and I'm going to change this from inches. What I want is pixels. I'm working in digital space. If I change that to pixels, that's a lot of guidelines. I don't want that many. But if we set it to one of our powers of 2, so that could be like 2, that's still very, very small. Whoops, let's go back here. And I'm going to move this over so we can see. So if I set it to 4, it's a little bigger. 8, still too small. 16, 32. Okay, now we can start to really see the difference. And if we go to 64, that's pretty big. If I go to 128, that looks good. Although even that is maybe more than I really want. I don't need the biggest grid line, so maybe I'll do 256. Okay, that's good for what I'm doing here. I'm not doing anything too crazy. So this gives us a nice little grid to work with. It kind of like blocks out our space, and what we'll see is that when we make shapes, the shapes will kind of snap to the grid. That's another thing that you can turn on and off. This option called snap, when we make a shape, it'll kind of like sort of jump to parts of the grid. But if you don't like that, you can turn that off. Okay, so let's actually make something over here in our toolbar. Let's go down here, and all the way at the bottom here is our shape tool. Right now it's set to ellipse, but if I hold this down, you'll see that we have different types of shapes. I'm going to start with a rectangle, just going to keep it simple. So I've got a rectangle tool, and when I have this tool selected, notice that a lot of things change. So up here, these little context menu things change. If I go back to my selection tool, the arrow, they kind of change. If I go up here, we see different things. So each tool has different little settings that go along with it, and Photoshop interface updates as we select different tools. So we can start to draw a rectangle. You'll notice that it has some properties up here. We're going to look at those in a moment. Let's draw a rectangle. So I'm going to start like up here at this point in the grid, and I'm just going to try to kind of make a big rectangle. And notice that as I move the mouse, it kind of snaps to these different parts of the grid. That's what that snapping is. So it kind of moves smoothly, and then if it gets close to a grid line, it snaps over. So that's what's nice about the grid, is it kind of makes it easy to make your shape line up with the specific part of your composition or your image. So once I make that rectangle, notice that it created a new layer. Layers in Photoshop are the way that we organize the different parts of our composition or our image. And we can do a couple things with the layer. So I can turn it on and off. You can notice that there's a background layer. This layer is locked so that you don't edit it. You can unlock it and edit it if you want, but I'm going to leave it on for now. So this little eyeball turns our layers on and off so we can preview different changes. And then we can select the layer. When we select the layer, it selects the shape that we created or anything else that we've put on that layer. And then once we select that shape, we can edit it. And this is called making transformation to the shape. So you'll notice over here in this properties window, there's some information about the shape. You can see the transform, the width, the height, the X position and the Y position. So you can actually, change the shape right here. If I want it to be exactly 800 pixels, I can set that right there. But we can also just use our selection tool and we can move the shape around. We can drag the edges to match our grid. If we drag on this little line, it will make the corners rounded. If we don't like that, we can hit Control Z. So Control Z will undo whatever the last thing you did is, and Control Shift Z will redo it. You can find those options under Edit at the top. You have Undo and Redo. So that's a good option. If you make a mistake, you can undo it or redo it. So if we go back to the selection tool, we can also rotate the image or the square. If we go to the kind of corner over here, we can rotate it around. We can, resize it. We can do all sorts of different stuff using these little boxes. If you want to lock the rectangle, that way it'll stay in place and you can't move it at all. We can also toggle off our grid. So I'm just hitting Control and quotation mark, and let's click over here. And so we can see what our composition looks like so far. So we've got this nice little blue rectangle. Let's turn our grid back on. So let's look at a couple properties up here. So we've got a fill. If we change this fill, this is the color of this rectangle. So if I want to make it darker, I can choose a color and hit OK, and that will change that color here. You also have under the properties panel right here, you can see this appearance settings here. So these are just the same thing. They're just in two different places. Just makes it a little more convenient to find stuff. You can see there's a lot of other options down here as well. So the fill is the color of the shape in the inside, and the stroke is the outline of the shape. So let's say I want a yellow color for the stroke. I'm going to choose that yellow, and it's hard to see right now. Let's turn our grid off. But if I make that stroke wider, so I can use this slider to change the size of the stroke. And so if I make it really big, it takes up a lot of the shape. If I make it smaller, it doesn't take up as much of the shape. And then we can also set where it comes from. So let's put the grid back on. You can see by default, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. Let's zoom into this corner. I'm also using the space bar to get this little hand tool, which lets me move the canvas around. So I can focus on different parts of my composition. Okay, so if I zoom in here, you can see that this outline is sort of going on both sides of the edge. But if I want it to only go inside, I can select that option, or I can just go on the outside. So depending on how precise you want to be with certain things, you have a lot of options here. We can also make rounded little corners if we want to. And we can also round off these edges if we want to. So there's lots of options over here. You may not want to use these options. You may want to just stick with something simple. We're just going to make a very basic, simple, abstract composition this week, so we don't need to do anything too crazy. So let's leave this here, and then let's make another layer. Whoops. Oh, I forgot to save. So this is a good thing to go over real quick. So notice up at the top of this little tab here, it says Untitled. So that's because I haven't saved this image yet. And I want to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to File and then click Save. And so this will allow me to save the file on my computer. And I really want to do that so that I don't lose changes that I make. So I'm going to find my project folder. I'm going to go to Documents, go to MMP 100, go to Image. And I'll just call this Photoshop intro.psd. PSD stands for Photoshop document. This is a specific type of document that we use to edit an image. We can't like publish this on the internet or like text it to somebody. It has a lot of information in it about like our layers and shapes and colors we use that makes it a very big file. What we'll do later in the next video is we're going to export a file that we can actually publish online. So we'll talk about the different types of files that we use when we're creating images and digital media as we go through our lessons. So I'm going to save this. I'm just going to hit OK here. And just to show that it's there, if I go back to the File Explorer, you can see that Photoshop intro document was created right there. You may not see this .psd. The default view for Windows is that there's no file extension. So you may see just this, or you may even see something like this. If you see that PSD there, that's a good sign. It should look like a Photoshop document. A couple things that you can change with the view in File Explorer. You can look at the details. So this will tell you how big. Okay, I'm gonna have to pause and I'll restart in just a moment.